A new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramesses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah: "When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him, and if it is a girl, let her live." But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. "Why have you allowed these boys to live?" "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women," the midwives replied. "They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time." So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live." About this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked alongside the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him, and later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him up out of the water." This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. So this week we are beginning our journey through the book of Exodus. And the reason why we're going to be going through Exodus in the coming weeks is because in a time filled with so much uncertainty, like the one we're walking through right now, it's important for us to ground ourselves in who God is and in who we are as God's people. by remembering what God has done to deliver God's people from difficulties in the past, we can draw strength for persevering through our present hard times, confident that God will see us through these as well. So our passage today begins with the ominous sentence, "A new king came to power in Egypt, who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done." Now, just in case you need a refresher on who Joseph was and what he did for Egypt, let's quickly recap the events in the last chapters of Genesis. So Joseph was one of 12 sons that Jacob, a man whose name God changed to Israel, and whose family God had promised to bless and to guide as God's very own people. And Joseph, one of these 12 sons of Jacob or Israel, was sold as a slave by his very jealous brothers, and he was taken from their family land in Canaan to Egypt. And while there, he was given an opportunity to interpret dreams, first for a couple of Pharaoh's servants, and later for the dreams of Pharaoh himself. And as a result of the wisdom that Joseph displayed in interpreting these dreams, Pharaoh put Joseph as the second in command of his entire kingdom in Egypt. And he allowed him to help lead Egypt to save and store food during a time of 7 years of plenty and abundant harvests. And then Joseph was also tasked with distributing the food carefully to everyone who was hungry during the following 7 years of a deep famine in the land. And the famine was so severe that even surrounding countries felt its effects. So Joseph's brothers, cue them, they come up from Canaan to beg for food. And Joseph takes the opportunity to meet with his brothers, to reconcile with them, to forgive them for selling him into slavery, and to give them the food that they need. And when Pharaoh hears that Joseph has a family, he invites all of them to move from Canaan to the land of Egypt and to settle and to work in a part of the country that the Egyptians really didn't care anything about. So they'd be kind of out of the way there. So true, they are immigrants in Egypt, but Joseph and his family enjoy all the blessings associated with being favored by the Pharaoh. And so they live and they prosper in Egypt. And so when we read in our text today that ominous note that eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing of Joseph or what he had done, we can feel the tone shift. We can feel the tone shift, and we're led to suspect that things are about to drastically change for the Israelites. So this new Pharaoh doesn't see the Israelites as welcomed guests, but instead as foreigners to be feared and as slaves to be oppressed. Egypt, by this point, has become a world superpower, and this new Pharaoh must protect that power at all costs. In fact, he's kind of paranoid about protecting his power, and so we see that play out in the biblical text. So Pharaoh comes up with a plan A to stifle the Israelites' growth, and he spreads word throughout the rest of Egypt. He says, "These Israelites are a threat to our national security. They must be enslaved with hard labor so that their growth is stopped, and they don't have any time to think about scheming against us." So he forces the Israelites to work tirelessly to build his great cities as he renovates the Nile Delta. But the thing is, Pharaoh's plan A doesn't really have his intended effects, does it? Instead, our biblical text tells us in verse 12 that the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became as a result. And no wonder. I mean, how is it possible logically that the Israelites could continue to grow in the very midst of being so oppressed. So it's a question that the text raises. And even so, for now, we know the answer. Of course, looking back, of course, God is in this. Of course, God is enabling their growth. But for now, the Egyptians are just left confused, and they're scared and they're frustrated and they don't get it. And so, how the Israelites could continue to grow in the midst of this oppression. And so, the Egyptians, out of fear, choose to work the Israelites even more without mercy, the text says, making their lives bitter, to the point that every spare minute the Israelites might have had for themselves or for their families is now filled with constant work for Pharaoh. And so at this point in the text, we wonder, how long can this continue? How long will God allow God's people to suffer like this? Something must be done. Something must be done. This is unbearable for the Israelites to endure. And we can imagine the Israelites go to bed every night wondering if the next day will be different. Wondering, when are things going to change? Wondering, when will God finally intervene? Well, then comes the word that Pharaoh has devised a plan B, meeting with the Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah and ordering them to promptly kill any Hebrew baby boy that they help deliver. And at this point we think, wow, could things get any more worse for the Israelites? How much more tragedy can they possibly endure? And yeah, immediately the tone in the text changes, because in verse 17 we read, because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. Isn't that incredible? That these two midwives, of all people, would defy a direct order from one of the most powerful pharaohs that Egypt had ever had? For these two women, these two immigrant women, to work explicitly against the command of the ruler of the superpower of the world in that day. That kind of courage could only come because of their faith in God. These two women risked their own lives in order to save the lives of these Hebrew baby boys. And that's not all. This is so great in the text. When Pharaoh summons them and he asks them why the Hebrew boys are still living, the courageous midwives diffuse Pharaoh with a bold and clever response that is laced with this sassy impertinence that Pharaoh perceives as a compliment to the delicacy of Egyptian women. He doesn't get it. These two lowly Hebrew women silence the king of Egypt with a single remark that stops him in his tracks and sends him back to the drawing board. Well, unfortunately, Pharaoh comes up with a plan C. And this time it's the deadliest one yet. He orders anyone and everyone in Egypt to throw a newborn Hebrew boy that they see into the Nile River. Now what? How are the Israelites going to get out of this one? They're every day living as slaves, working constantly for Pharaoh. And now here they are, terrified and grief-stricken that their baby boys will be killed. How can they possibly withstand such fear and grief and loss? What will happen to them as a people in a few generations if this command continues? Well, as chapter 2 of Exodus opens, we read that a Hebrew man and woman marry and they have a baby boy. And so instead of being a cause for celebration, this new little family is thrown into desperation. How can they keep their son from being discovered and drowned? Well, the boy's mother courageously does her best to hide him. She defies the law of the state to try to keep her son alive. And finally, when he can't be hidden any longer because what baby is quiet all the time, she prepares a little basket and she waterproofs it with care. And interestingly, the same Hebrew word used here for this basket is used only one other time in the Old Testament. And that's to describe what God calls Noah to build to help escape the flood. So here, this new mother constructs this basket or ark with waterproofing to carry her son over the perilous waters and hopefully to some kind of freedom. And as she sets her son in the little ark and places it on the Nile River, exactly where Pharaoh has commanded the Egyptians to drown the Hebrew boys, she gets the baby boy's sister Miriam to follow and to watch over the little ark and the boy inside. And when the little ark floats down the Nile River and it finds the shore right where and when Pharaoh's daughter is going to bathe, Miriam's heart must have beat wildly. She watches Pharaoh's daughter lift the lid to the little ark and look and see the baby inside, crying. And we're left to wonder, what will Pharaoh's daughter do? Will she report the baby to her father or to the guards? Will she herself throw the baby unprotected into the Nile to drown? But she does neither. She sees the boy, she looks at him, she listens to his cries, and that stirs compassion in her towards him. She knows instantly that this must be a Hebrew baby boy because no other mother would be reduced to making a little ark to float in the Nile with their precious baby inside. Compassion fills her. And so then we have Miriam, Moses' big sister. She knows she should remain hidden. She should run back to her mom where it's safe, but she can't help herself anymore. So she comes out of her hiding place and she offers Pharaoh's daughter to get a woman who could nurse the baby for her. How convenient, right? But Pharaoh's daughter doesn't hesitate. She likes this plan and she says, yes, go get her, and I will even pay her for her trouble. So together, this young Hebrew girl, protective of her baby brother, and this Egyptian daughter of Pharaoh form a plan to provide for and to raise this little boy. And sure enough, when he gets older, Pharaoh's daughter adopts him as her own son and names him Moses. Talk about an awkward tension in Pharaoh's house, right? But more on that later. Today, as we have heard this story and heard it again, and maybe we've heard this story hundreds of times before, and we may be thinking, this is a great story. It's one of our favorites. But what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with my faith journey? Well, here are just a couple of takeaways from this rich text. First, this story reminds us that even when we find ourselves in the midst of a season of suffering, we can take comfort from and draw strength in knowing that God is still at work even then. When the Israelites faced year after year of oppression from Pharaoh, first that heavy slavery that left them without a moment to themselves, and then added to that the edict that their baby boys would be killed by the Egyptians, the Israelites had to wonder at times, where is God in the midst of all of this? When will God do something to relieve our suffering? How will God get us out of this mess? The grand, sweeping gestures of God's direct actions for God's people will take place soon enough. But for now, during this season of suffering without a clear end in sight, God is still at work, but it's in the background, choosing instead to quietly work through others to accomplish God's promises and purposes. As we'll see, and as will be the case for so much of the Israelites' history as a people, they must go through times of adversity on the way to the fulfillment of God's promises. While it may have appeared to the Israelites as they experienced the reality of everyday suffering and grief, as though their situation was hopeless, God was still and is always at work. And so I don't know who needs to hear this morning, but hear this if it's for you. In this season of suffering in your life, or in the life of someone you love, if you've been wondering where God is and whether you are going to be able to get through this difficult time that feels like it's never going to end, hear the good news. God is at work in your life. God is not giving up on you. God has not abandoned you. God has not left you alone to suffer. God is with you and is at work in your life. You just may not, like the Israelites in our story today, see exactly how just yet. But hold on, because God is at work in your life. And a second takeaway from this passage today is that God often chooses to work through people that others have written off as insignificant, or have ignored, or have belittled, or oppressed. God chooses those people as the very people to carry God's message, to model God's compassionate heart, and to act in ways that further God's purposes. In our passage today, we see this through the 5 strong women, the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, Moses' mother, Jochebed, Moses' sister, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter, all of whom see a need and rise to meet that need with courage, compassion, and bold action. God loves to use those that worldly powers consider weak to overthrow the strong. We see that over and over again throughout the scriptural story. So be encouraged today that God can use you right where you are, in your home, with your family, at your workplace, at your school, wherever you go, and whoever you can influence with your words and actions to see a need and to rise to meet that need through your faith in God, empowering you with courage, compassion, and bold action, just like the 5 women in our passage today. Who knows? Maybe you will be the one, your words, your action, your time. Maybe you will be the one to remind someone who is in a season of suffering that God is at work in their life, that God is with them. What better way to spend our time and our energy than being such a person for someone else? Amen.